Today I'll talk about the effect of venial sin on the soul. It's an important topic because obviously you, in order to be ordained, you have to overcome any habits of mortal sin. Otherwise, that's something that has to be completely excluded from your life. But there remains venial sin. Our Lord said the just man sins 7 times a day. And there's 2 types of venial sin. One is deliberate venial sin. The other is sins of weakness. Sins of weakness. The deliberate venial sin, I may have explained this to you before, but I'll say it again in case you haven't, is to commit a sin with a complacency about its sinfulness. Gluttony, typically. I know I'm overeating, but it's only a venial sin, so I'll have another bite. See, that's a deliberate venial sin. Now, all sin is deliberate. You can't be guilty unless it's deliberate. So, sins of weakness are those which proceed from faults which we have not sufficiently mortified. All right, so anger, impatience, things that we don't think about. The drawer won't open, so we get impatient. See, and that's without even thinking about it. You might do that. You say maybe you wouldn't. Maybe you just leave the drawer closed. But everybody's different. There is everybody, or laziness, a very common source of what we call sins of weakness. Very, very common. So during the day, there's all sorts of ways in which you commit sins of weakness, typically. Or you could commit some deliberate venial sins. The deliberate venial sin removes the possibility, or attachment to it, removes the possibility of gaining indulgences. I don't know if you know that. But not sins of weakness. But sins of weakness, nonetheless, need to be despised and avoided as best you can. But only Our Blessed Lady was exempt from any venial sin. So the fact that you are acquiring venial sins during the week and confessing them is something quote unquote normal, in the sense that you could not possibly avoid those sins except with a special grace. All right. To understand this, there is an analogy to the soul and heart. When a person is dying, the soul gradually leaves diverse parts of the body, but remains in the heart until the very last. So venial sin stifles the life of grace in the soul, even though the state of grace remains entire. So we're going to say that venial sin stifles grace. It doesn't remove it, but it stifles it. Something like the difference between a big bonfire, hot bonfire, and a fire that's in the fireplace, very small. In other words, what it ruins is the brightness of charity. It doesn't take away charity, but it ruins its brightness, we might say. So it doesn't take away or even diminish sanctifying grace in the soul. So you're in the state of sanctifying grace even after a deliberate venial sin, but it weakens this life of grace and deprives it of the use of its activity. See, so it dulls the effect of it. Charity in the soul remains inactive, sterile, and unproductive. It remains in the soul, but it is stifled by venial sin. It could be compared to ashes on top of a fire. The fire is still going, but it has lost its brightness and activity. So venial sin, is something to really hate. I should never be complacent with it. Now, venial sin does not remove the state of grace, since it is not against the essential resolution of charity, which is to prefer God above all things. So charity requires us to love God above all things, and therefore to be ready to set aside any kind of temptation to sin against his will. That's charity. In other words, anything that's against his will, it sets aside and despises, and see that charity can only survive if that is your resolution. If you are willing to accept something contrary to the law of God, which is serious, in a serious way, then you destroy charity. Charity is the first effect of sanctifying grace, the virtue of charity. So mortal sin is mortal sin because we set aside God in order to enjoy a creature. So let's say you resolve to rob a bank. You know it's wrong. You know it's stealing. It's against the seventh commandment. It's a lot of money. It's not just a quarter or a dime or something like that. Couple of $100,000. Right? That is a typical mortal sin. So you accept to do that. You know it's wrong. You do it. Venial sin is venial since it invokes an excessive enjoyment of a creature without setting aside God. Typical example is gluttony. See, so it's not seriously against the law of God. Gluttony would be serious if you were to endanger your health, for example, by eating so much. You already weigh 500 pounds and you want to get to 600. So it is, you see, that's what we call poverty of matter. That's one of the ways in which a sin is venial, is by poverty of matter. It's small matter. So if you were to decide, I'm going to steal $1, that's not a mortal sin. So the other way in which a sin can be venial is by imperfection of the act. That is, that you don't have sufficient reflection, or you have ignorance about what you're doing in some way, that there is something missing in the act. So even in grave matter, if you have imperfection of the act, then it becomes venial. And that's what you have to figure out in the confessional by questions, etc. Sometimes it's very clear whether it's mortal or venial. Sometimes it's not clear. And that would depend, that also dictates what penance you give. You see, if somebody's committing venial sins, then your penance is lighter. If it's mortal, your penance is heavier. So we busy ourselves more than we should with the things of earth, yet without forsaking the things of heaven. So that's typical of venial sin. To be worldly. Venial sin disturbs charity and runs contrary to its operations, just like the ashes on the fire. It is like a wind that strips a tree of all of its fruit. The tree is still there, but its operation, its fruit, has been taken from it. Venial sin enslaves charity, with the effect that although we know what we should do to love God, we choose not to do it. You know, I should really do my work now, but I don't feel like it. See, that's a perfect venial sin. Yeah, it could be mortal if it's a serious thing, but most of the time that's venial. I think I'll take a nap instead. You know, where you don't really need a nap. That's me. Or you could do something else. Remember that laziness is not necessarily sitting in a chair and doing nothing. It could be doing something else that you should not be doing, neglecting your work and your state of life work for some other thing, some hobby or interest that you might have. That's laziness. You're not doing what you should be doing. Venial sin deprives the soul of its interior familiarity with God, since it dampens the soul's affection for God in favor of an affection for something created. So when you get into habits of venial sin, your mind is constantly on created things, and your love of God is minimal. It's surviving. It's about it. And that's why we say that venial sin paves the way to mortal sin, because you are constantly interested in created things and drawing your attention to created things. That is the path to a mortal sin. Mortal sin becomes very easy after that. Whereas if you are constantly fighting venial sin, the thought of a mortal sin becomes absolutely unacceptable. Venial sin eventually causes a spiritual paralysis, and if this is left unattended, the soul falls into spiritual death through mortal sin. What I just said. Charity is love of God, and like any love, must either act or die. Love, by its very nature, is active. It wants to do something. It wants to be attached to the beloved, whatever it should be. If it's money, then you're a miser and you want to be attached to your money. If it's some sport, skiing or something, or playing soccer, then there's this. It inspires activity necessarily, because it leads you to the object. Love wants you to be united to the object. And in order for you to be united to the object, you must act. And if you don't act, it kills off love. So venial sin, in depriving the soul of its activity, of its activity, ultimately sentences charity to death. So, for example, if you never pray, you're well on your way to mortal sin. So we must daily fight against our habits of venial sin. That is a very big part of the spiritual life. There was an ancient athlete who, in order to prepare for games, lifted day after day the same calf. Imagine doing that. He was finally able to lift it even when he had grown, the calf had grown into a huge ox. So little by little. He did not realize that day by day the burden became slightly heavier. And so it is in venial sin. So these are the typical venial sins. Anger, high on the list. But you'll see in moral theology that even when husband and wife say a lot of nasty things to each other, that's still venial sin. That's in Merkel book. So, I wish I had never married you, and, you're the worst husband in the world, or you're the worst wife that could ever exist, and things like that, the typical exchanges between husband and wife, those are all venial sins. So when you hear that, I had a big argument with my husband or with my wife and said some nasty things, you would take that as venial ordinarily. It happens in every family. It's two people from two different backgrounds living together in a very intimate way. And they're not going to be perfect, either of them. So there's going to be always some disagreement. So it's not something to be too upset about. Gluttony is another big one. That's big. Impatience, also big source of venial sin. A lack of fraternal charity, so either by failure to do something or by saying nasty things about people, talking behind their backs, all of those sins against fraternal charity. Laziness, another big one. Lying. All right, telling lies. There are three types of lies. There's the malicious lie, which is meant to destroy someone or to do damage. You see, that's so you. Then there is the jocose lie, which is to tell somebody a falsehood for fun. The typical example is St. Thomas Aquinas, who was on the second floor studying, and there were students down at in the courtyard. Thomas, come to the window. There's a cow flying, and he looks out, and they all laugh. Thomas, did you really think there was a cow flying? And the famous quote is, "I would sooner believe that a cow were flying than that a monk were lying." That's what he said. So, and venial sins of impurity, such as impurity is of its nature always grave. The matter is always grave in impurity, but it does admit of imperfection of the act. For example, sinful curiosity, looking too long at something without actually enjoying it or committing the sin, or where there's an imperfection of the act, as far as any of the things that might make the act imperfect. But that you'll study in moral theology. So occasionally impurity can be venial. Usually listening to impure jokes, especially among people who would not be particularly scandalized by it, was generally venial. But that doesn't mean it's good. But it's, like a lot of people in a bar or something like that, and you hear it's you should just walk away from those things. But that would be typically venial in that category. Vanity. That's a big one. Yes, vanity, because it's so hidden. You see, it often presents itself under the guise of virtue. That's to be excessively pleased with your own perfection. So you might be the best opera singer in the world. That's a fact. You're not, but that's a fact. But if you are excessively pleased with it and expect honors for it, that's vanity. See, so to flaunt your perfections, everybody has certain perfections. Some people have some great perfections, but to flaunt it, to show it, and that's vanity. Very common sin. Women are particularly subject to it. Pride. There are various types of pride. There's like a diabolical pride which revolts against God. That's typically heresy and things like that. That's not usually the sin. That's obviously mortal. But a pride of selfishness, thinking about only your own ends, not your own what you want. Or could come out in intellectual pride, where you are convinced that you are St. Thomas Aquinas, and everybody else is wrong because you're St. Thomas. You're the 21st century St. Thomas. I'm exaggerating, of course, but you can get into an intellectual pride, which is very dangerous, and it happens to clergy. So trusting in your own mind too much, and it can lead to some very, very devastating sins. That's the beginning of heresy. Lack of forgiveness of injuries. That could be mortal, but usually it isn't. I don't know if I told you, told this joke a lot, but an Italian man said to me, do you know how to tell that an Italian is dead? I said, no. He said, he's not holding any more grudges. So apparently, and this is an Italian man that told me that. He said, apparently Italians hold these grudges forever. 3 generations ago, your grandfather did this. So you have to forgive injuries. But that could be easily venial. Sometimes it could be mortal. And resentment, if you're corrected or somebody says something to you, or resentments. St. Alphonsus calls that a tumor mentis, a tumor of the mind, where you are constantly thinking about injury. So those are typical venial sins. So distinguish the venial sins of frailty and deliberate venial sin. I did that already. The sins of frailty or weakness happen every day, even in great saints. If they are immediately detested, they should be immediately detested, and means should be taken to overcome them. That's why you frequently confess. And you're probably confessing the same thing all the time. That's very typical. Don't get discouraged by that, because you have certain faults that generally proceed from your character or your upbringing, and or both. Could be both. So if you're prone to anger, prone to laziness. All right, just let me finish this. And the deliberate venial sin is, as I said, a complacency in sinning. And this complacency is what takes a toll on the soul and eventually paralyzes it and leads it into mortal sin. So the remedy against venial sin is, first of all, prayer, which solves everything. All of your problems are solved by prayer. And your desire to make progress, everything, just pray. All right. 2, avoidance of occasions. And 3, contrary actions. So if you're gluttonous, then give up dessert. Let's see. And immediate sorrow for the sin committed, and that would be true of especially the sins of weakness. Immediate detestation, right away you did something, you got upset or impatient. You immediately, and those venial sins, if you have contrition, are remitted by the confiteor, by other things, other various ways in which they are, even outside the confessional, they are remitted. I think even the asperges, if you receive those piously, a pious communion remits all venial sin, but you must be sorry for them. Nothing will remit sin if you're not sorry. All right? Okay, that's it.